continuo, which is an adverb that usually means suddenly. It doesn't mean continuously. For the most part, I have seen it used that way. So you do have to be careful. By the way, another 25% of English vocabulary is from French. 25, and these are very rough figures. 25% comes from its Germanic ancestors. So you can see English itself is not a pure language at all. It's sort of made up of bits and pieces from other languages, which most people aren't aware of. I had a teacher once, before he was a professor at a American college. He taught at the Vatican's Pontifical Bible Institute. He was a priest, a Jesuit priest. He taught in Latin, and all class discussion was in Latin. And so if it was completely in Latin, I don't know if they cheated a little bit, but people at the school came from all over the world, so Latin was a good lingua franca, and it's still in use there. However, Latin is really dead in the sense that no one learns it as a native language. There is no language-free young child who learns it from his parents or whoever, caregiver. I'm aware of one case, the French essayist from the 16th century, Michel de Montaigne. There's a famous anecdote about him that his father hired a German tutor to live with him and teach him Latin before he learned the French of the country he was living in. We don't know much about what actually went on pedagogically. Did the tutor actually teach actively, teaching him rules and things like that, or did Michel just learn it the way children do? They just hear things and they figure out the rules on their own. Anyway, Montaigne is probably the only, he's early modern, he could lay claim to having Latin as a native language. For a long time, Europeans weren't as committed as Montaigne's father, but they made a lot of effort in school to produce people who could use classical Latin. That's the language of Cicero and Julius Caesar. I'll come back and talk about that definition, because what classical Latin exactly was is a little bit unclear. But in teaching Latin as a second language, Europeans did it through what are now called immersion programs in schools. Shakespeare is a famous case. He got 8 years of a Tudor grammar school, which was basically all about Latin for 8 years. John Milton, the English poet, reached a very high degree of competence, as is shown that during the English Revolution, Cromwell, the head of government, selected him to be their chief propagandist in defending the revolution in the eyes of Europe. Though the tide was shifting in the 17th century to the European vernaculars, Milton's writing was in Latin, and so was the response of his French opponent, Salmasius. And Milton, as you might know, also produced a large body of poetry in Latin with seemingly as much ease as in English. So other evidence suggests, however, that the training that people got, and this was a very small sliver of the population, obviously, it wasn't that successful in many cases. We only know this indirectly, and with hints. I recently read a biography of Jonathan Swift that suggests that he didn't learn much. He was known for not having absorbed much at university, but he was noted for his oral proficiency in Latin. He could speak it really well. Now, on the other hand, that suggests a lot of other people didn't learn to speak it very well, but we really don't know. And of course, there's a famous thing about Shakespeare's Little Latin and Less Greek in the preface to the first folio by Ben Jonson. Nowadays, it's thought, I mentioned it, it's thought the Tudor era grammar schools would have produced very good Latinists. So Ben Jonson's jibe may have been off the mark. As an aside, if any of you are a classics professor, please forgive me. Medieval and Renaissance command of Latin may have been better than the average classics professor today. I recently read a blog by the Cambridge classicist, Mary Beard, who's probably the most famous classicist in the world, and she confessed that classicists can't, she confessed she can't sight read Latin or Greek very well. She can't pick up a text and read it like a newspaper. And what the Tudor era educational system did differently was work very hard on making students speak and write actively. Modern Greek and Latin courses don't do that. The focus is on reading and interpreting difficult texts, what are mostly difficult texts. They're intrinsically difficult, like Tacitus, They're difficult just because they're old, and the concepts and the assumptions made by the writer, you just don't know what they are. So we end up in a situation today where the average classicist can parse and interpret a Latin document quite well, but they don't bother to actually use Latin in real life situations. It seems silly to us to even do it, but for most of European history, that is exactly what educated people strove to do. We don't live, many of you are from, speak other languages than English natively, but it's one thing most Americans have a lot of problem dealing with, is dealing with a bilingual culture. We just aren't used to it here, and until recently anyway. Another anecdote about the use of Latin: when Erasmus, the famous Renaissance scholar and producer, and among many other things, he produced the first scholarly edition of the New Testament, he once came to visit England, and he expected to converse with his scholarly peers in Latin. He was Dutch, of course, and he was upset to discover that the English had developed a pronunciation of Latin that was completely different from what was spoken on the continent. You may have heard of that. You know, in Italy, they say pater, the word for father, and that's approximately what the Romans would have said. But in England, they say pater. What happened in England, it underwent what linguists call the great vowel shift in the 13th to 14th centuries. Basically, this is early modern English, and the pronunciation of all the long vowels, they moved up a notch in the mouth. Vowels are defined by the place in the mouth where they're articulated. You have front vowels, the front of the mouth, like E, and you have back vowels like O. All the long vowels, English had a distinction between short and long vowels at the time. They just moved up, and that disconnected the pronunciation of English from pretty much every other Western European language. It was a very, and that raises another question. There are different pronunciations of Latin in different countries. I won't go into that in much detail. Is that Latin being a dead language, you only have the letters on the page, and you have no hint as to how they should sound. In fact, the Irish monks developed their own system of pronunciation. I don't think much is known about it. At least I don't know much about it. But you have different versions of Latin running around, and you hear that the Catholic Church has its own pronunciation of Latin, and this happens. And sort of, I might mention modern Israeli Hebrew sort of is another example of this phenomenon. It's been claimed that Hebrew, as spoken in Israel, isn't a Semitic language at all, but it's really Yiddish, with a dollop of Russian or whatever. But what they've done is they've adopted a huge amount of Hebrew vocabulary from the Bible and medieval sources. I think that's a strong claim. I don't believe it, but it's still a fact that the first speakers of Hebrew who resurrected the language, basically in the late 19th century, they were native speakers of Yiddish for the most part. So I should qualify the status of Latin in Europe a bit. Although used orally, it was still an imitation of the original written language of Cicero and Caesar. In other words, it was in what linguists call the formal register of Latin. We don't have much access to how Cicero spoke with his friends, his family, of his slaves. There are his letters. We know Cicero better than any other ancient person, but we still don't have access to what he sounded like when he was relaxed with his friends or family. We don't know that. The ancients had even stronger ideas than we do about the difference between spoken and written language and the need to keep them separate. In English today, we're so used, writing is more and more, it resembles the way we speak, and some people think that's a good thing and others don't. So you can create a thought experiment. You can imagine Caesar coming back from the dead, and he tries speaking with a similarly resurrected Milton. He would probably have found Milton's Latin pretty comprehensible and correct. By the way, Caesar was very interested in language. He wrote a book about it. But Caesar would have thought Milton's Latin was pretty formal, because Milton didn't speak in the English style. He knew Italian, by the way. He had an Italian friend growing up, and he learned Italian. He was very gifted at languages. But Milton was adopted the Italian pronunciation, which was much closer to the classical Latin one. So Caesar would not have had much of a problem with Milton's sounds. He may have had a problem with Milton's vocabulary, because although they would have had the same core vocabulary, the medievals and the Renaissance people added an immense number of words that the Romans didn't know. Let me keep going. So where did it all begin? Let me get rid. Oops. Well, this is what linguists call a Stammbaum. It's the Indo-European language tree. Oops. So you have Proto-Indo-European up at the top, and the various Indo-European languages. I won't go into it. You have Latin down here. Latin branches off into the modern day Romance languages. The immediate ancestor of Latin is something called Italic, which is a theoretical construct. We don't have any texts containing Italic, but there are other languages than Latin that are related to Latin, like Oscan and Umbrian. So Latin, as you can see, it's an Indo-European language. Linguists they use the term Indo-European because the Indo comprises the Sanskrit is at the eastern end of the language area, and the Germanic languages are at the western end. I guess Iceland counts, and we ignore the New World at this point. Also, there are Indo-European languages here, obviously. People noticed for many centuries that languages in Europe had strong similarities with each other. It took a while to figure out that these languages are all descended from the same source language, which is no longer spoken, Proto-Indo-European. It was the icing on the cake when in the 18th century, and even it was observed earlier, that Sanskrit, the sacred language of the Hindus in India, by the way, it has a spoken language community today too, a small one. It was noticed that Sanskrit had amazing similarities with Greek, and given Europe's colonialist and racist attitudes at the time, it was really quite mind-blowing to scholars that Greek, the language of Homer, Europe's greatest and most praised poet, looked a lot like Sanskrit. It was the language of a non-European culture. So back to Latin, information isn't available, but it's assumed that the people speaking the ancestors of Latin appeared in the Italian peninsula at some point. The date is very vague, anywhere from 6000 BC to 2000 BC, but people speaking similar languages arrived there from somewhere, probably from the east, where all of that stuff was coming from. So it's the language that eventually became Latin started to form. It's known today as Archaic Latin. It's somewhat different from the Latin we know, unless you're a real Latinist and read the archaic stuff. Somewhere along the Tiber River, the people who spoke Archaic Latin eventually built their own city in the same spot, and they called it Rome. Now, Rome was heavily influenced by people known as the Etruscans, which was located in the north of the Italian peninsula. These were mysterious people, like the Basques today. They spoke a unique language, still unrelated to any other. And the Romans borrowed a whole lot of cultural items, architecture and whatever from them. What's of particular interest, we got our naming convention of first, middle, and last name. We get it from Rome, but the Romans adopted it from the Etruscans. Previously, the Roman, and more widely the Indo-European custom, was to use only one name with possibly a patronymic. So Socrates was Socrates. It wasn't Socrates Smith or anything like that at the time. And of course, that had something to do with growth in population and the need to differentiate. But that's, we got our naming convention from the Etruscans. So here's the language situation on a map in early Latin time. Latin owes its name to its home region of Latium in west central Italy. That's modern day Lazio. Why is the language not known as Roman? It wasn't Latium that spread the language. It was the city-state of Rome within Latium. Romans always referred to their language as lingua latina, never lingua romana. It just wasn't the name of the language. And as I mentioned, Etruscan, other influences from Etruscan, I just picked some curious one. Etruscan, as I said, is a non-Indo-European language, may have come from Phrygia in Asia. It's what linguists call a language isolate. It has no known relatives and is clearly very old. It dominated the northern portion of the Italian peninsula before the rise of Rome. And as I said, the Romans looked up to them as the greater culture at the time. So the language group that includes Latin is called Italic, and they include Faliscan, the closest relative. You can see it on the map there, the closest relative of Latin. And also Umbrian and Venetic and Oscan in the south. And most of these languages are known to varying degrees, some pretty well and some not well at all. They're mostly from inscriptions on gravestones and that sort of evidence. And as I said, when the Italic people speaking the Italian languages came to Italy, no one knows. There's no consensus on that. It's a 4,000 year estimate from the 6th to the 2nd millennium. So what distinguishes Italic from other Indo-European groups? There are several things. There's the consonant F, which is quite common in Latin, flos, forum, what have you. And the Indo-European sound was either what's called an aspirated bh or dh, which disappeared in Latin, but it showed up as F. Other words, fores, finger. Oscan and Umbrian are similar. That's why we know they're related. They show similar phenomena. Basically, Italic languages, Latin included, it's simplified quite a bit from the Indo-European proto-language. If you've studied Latin, you know it has 4 different nice and tidy classes of verbs known as conjugations. Proto-Indo-European wasn't like that. The classes in Latin are created by the different vowels that come at the end of verbs. That's how, amo, amas, amat. But you have 4 different classes: amat, the love, monet, monere, wan, regere, to rule, and audi, to hear, audia. By the way, there's an interesting, why is the Audi automobile named Audi? It seemed the founder, the engineer, was named Horchen, Friedrich Horchen. And that means here to listen to in German, but he lost a intellectual property battle and he couldn't use his name anymore. So he just translated it to Latin, which is why the car company is now called Audi. It really means it's the imperative form here in Latin. And Latin is very regular. It's just about the easiest classical Indo-European language to learn. It only has 6 or 7 irregular verbs. Ferro, volo, sum, possum. If you've had Latin, and they're easy to learn. If you've studied Greek, Greek is totally different. They have hundreds of irregular verbs and a much richer morphology. It's considerably more difficult to learn than Latin. Sanskrit is even more difficult than Greek. But Latin was a pretty good choice for lingua franca in Europe because it's easy to learn relatively. Doesn't have any difficult sounds. It only has 5 vowels, the familiar I, E, O, U, A. It's pretty straightforward as a language. So Latin continued to develop as Rome itself grew. In 509 BCE, the Romans overthrew their king and established the Roman Republic. By this time, they were speaking and writing a pre-classical form of Latin. As the Romans developed their republic, they used this language to write their histories, philosophies, and political treatises. Latin became more standardized as Rome developed a sophisticated intellectual culture. Finally, around 100 BCE, the Romans had codified their language into what we call classical Latin. This was the language of intellectuals, poets, and philosophers, and it helped issue in the golden, and these were terms invented by the ancients, they still continue today. They helped issue in the golden age of Latin literature. This is period basically centering around the reign of Augustus. 50 years on each side, and it lasted from the late Republic to the early years of the Roman Empire. And the period features the works of the greatest literary masters, including Cicero, Virgil, Ovid, and Livy. It's important to remember, though, that the term classical Latin is quite arbitrary. The Romans had, in the Roman mind, the best writers also spoke the best Latin, even though logically there's no real connection between them, but that's how they felt, and that's how many people feel today about great writers in languages. But to a modern linguist, they're kind of confusing the beauty and the aesthetic effect of something like a poem or a political oration, which the Romans were very fond of, with the basic mechanics of a language. How does the language express past, present, and future? How many case endings does it have, if it has any? On the other hand, is in favor of the Romans, and I say this about my own profession, is that linguists, particularly American ones, are completely oblivious to aesthetics and language. It just doesn't exist for them, with a very few exceptions. In Europe, it's a somewhat different situation. So Latin had begun, and that's Cicero on the slide, by the way. Latin had begun as the language of a very small city-state, but it spread first of all through the Italian peninsula. Then it ousted pretty much all the existing languages in Western Europe. There were a few survivors: Basque, Welsh, Irish. People just don't know. Most people just don't know the Celtic languages, weren't restricted to the western edge of the European peninsula. It's not a continent, a European continent, as they are today. They're spoken in Ireland and Wales, but Celtic languages covered most of Western Europe, all the way to the Danube, and now they're all gone. So how did that happen? So Latin reached all parts of the Roman Empire. You're seeing that slide shows the Roman Empire at its peak in 117 AD, after Trajan conquered Dacia. You see in the north there, which is today Romania. So Latin was a language spread by force of arms: colonial settlement, trading networks, cultural diffusion, military recruitment, and religious conversion with the onset of Christianity. So that's a very interesting point too, is that the dominance of Latin survived the transition from a pagan empire under Constantine in the 4th century to the dominance of the Christian religion. And we'll come back to that topic later, because odd thing about Christianity, they took over Latin, and that makes sense, because by then it was the vernacular language of most of the population. They also took over a great deal of pagan Latin literature, culturally, it strikes me as very odd they did that. But the prestige of Latin was such that the Christians just decided to live with, the phenomenon of Dante using a pagan Virgil as a central figure in his poem is really quite odd when you think about it. So anyway, Latin also made possible, all the way down to our times, made possible the development of the idea of a unified Europe. Before Rome and the Roman Empire, there were different languages and cultures all over Europe. Once the Romans had done their thing, whether you approve of it or not, it was a much more unified area. So for the people who spoke and wrote it, Latin was their constant companion. Learning it was the universal key for entry into their culture, and expression in it was the unchanging means for taking any kind of social action. From the founding of Rome about 750 BC straight through to about 1250 CE in the medieval period, long after the end of the Roman Empire itself as a political unit, Latin was the exclusive means for conveying culture. Why did I limit it to 1250? Well, at that time, the hold of Latin on the educated began to slip, and the vernacular languages that emerged from what scholars traditionally called vulgar Latin began to emerge, and over time pushed Latin off the stage. But we won't discuss that here. In the following, we'll discuss how Latin came to be. So why did Latin succeed in pushing all its rival languages off off the stage. So for centuries, people have debated why the Romans succeeded in building an empire, why Rome, of all places, did so well. I won't go into that question here, but I will point out some of the factors that caused Latin to spread throughout the empire. At the outset, wherever they went, the Latin language was something imposed on a largely unwilling populace, as far as we can tell. It wasn't the beauty of Latin grammar that produced the growth, but clever decisions that the Romans made. First, the imposition of empire involved both taxes and military conscription. The Romans were very good at what they did. The latter, the conscription, was critical to the spread of Latin. Since the Roman army operated in Latin, a huge mix of different nationalities learned to speak it. We don't know much about how it happened. When you had Numidians and British were together in the same unit, how did they communicate? Did they have to develop a kind of highly simplified pidgin Latin to talk to each other, which they had both managed to pick up from native Latin speakers in their midst? Did the Romans offer some kind of language training? Excuse me? Did the Romans offer some kind of language training? That's hard to imagine, since the Romans throughout their history took little interest in the languages and cultures of lands they conquered. They wouldn't have paid any attention to the languages of their recruits, but they had to get their orders across. But we just don't know how the language learning proceeded. Apart from Greek, which they looked up to, and I'll come back to that topic, and knowing Greek became an essential part of Roman aristocratic culture, there's no record of any Roman bothering to learn, say, Gaulish, the Celtic language spoken in Gaul, today's France. Roman soldiers must have learned something just in order to function in Gaul, Britannia, or other provinces, but nothing has survived. At the elite level, Julius Caesar had interesting things, and in his Gallic War, he had interesting things to say about Gauls and Germans. And Tacitus wrote a notorious book, Germania. It has become notorious, Germania. It was a description of the ancient Germanic tribes, and it's the first place where he described them as being tall, blonde, and blue-eyed, and they were racially pure. Tacitus didn't put it that way, but he said the Germanic tribes forbade intermarriage with outsiders, so producing and the Nazis really loved this stuff. It was a favorite of theirs. But there is no record of a Roman, aside from Caesar and Tacitus, there's no record of a Roman intellectual deciding, to go to Gaul, become a kind of a proto-anthropologist, and, recording the language, the Gaulish language. It just didn't happen. The Romans just weren't interested. The Romans, in addition to recruitment, the Romans were also very good at co-opting the local elites, who were mostly trying to accommodate themselves to Roman control. One governor of Britain, even instituted a policy of deliberate flattery and had the sons of the British chiefs taught liberal arts in order to attract them to the use of Latin. And they also started wearing togas along with colonnades and bands and all the rest of the Roman stuff of what the Romans considered civilized. Other reasons for the spread of Latin? First, when the Romans defeated an enemy, they didn't usually destroy their city and enslave the inhabitants, but instead they demanded tracts of land from it. This would allow Rome to establish a new Roman settlement, a colony, and they would settle the veteran soldiers there. These then were filled up with Roman or other Latin speakers. Another major factor was the building of roads. These linked the provinces back to Rome. This was especially true of the West, where Latin became the dominant language. It was different in the East. I'll get to that. Latin speakers were able to travel more easily and farther than speakers of any other single language. In the end, Latin came to be used at all levels of society over the centuries and over wide swaths of territory. We don't have much information about the process. Roman intellectuals, as I said, took no notice of it in their writing. Latin was important enough for economic survival that people came to adopt it, if only in public spaces or in business when they continue speaking something else at home. But we don't know much about that. Eventually, in most places, Latin ousted the other languages completely. And this, another thing, this dominance of Latin survived the German I'm using the word barbarian here, which has gone out of fashion, but and I know it's pejorative, but they survived the barbarian invasions, even though, and what this is where it gets really weird, even though Germanic-speaking tribes had moved into large parts of the empire by the 4th and 5th century, their languages did not supplant Latin. Latin survived and flourished with the newcomers adopting it eventually. This resulted in a very strange paradox that the Franks, a Germanic tribe, became in history perceived as the founders of a country called France, which speaks today a non-Germanic language. The original Germanic that their ancestors spoke has completely disappeared. It's unclear what the links are between ancient Germanic languages and modern German and Dutch. So, we don't know much about ancient Germanic languages, actually. And these original Germanic languages eventually mostly disappeared. And by the way, for ancient Germanic languages, we only have written evidence for Gothic, the language of the Goths, and that only because they Christianized early and the Gospels were translated into it. How the ancient Germanic languages differed from each other is unknown. There is one notable exception to this survival of Latin, this persistence of Latin, and that is in Britain, which is another strange historical fact. Although the Romans occupied the place for 400 years, Latin did not survive and did not evolve into a Romance language of some kind. In an alternate universe, there might have been a British kind of French or Italian, but it never happened. When the Saxons invaded after the Roman Empire, when they invaded in the 5th century, and later other Germanic groups came to Britain, their languages came to dominate. Hence, we speak English. The reasons are unclear. A plague, an outbreak of plague may have reduced the native Latin-speaking population to a degree that it just couldn't survive, but it's unknown. And balanced with that, another problem is the origin of the modern language Romanian. It's descended from the province Dacia, as I said, Dacia, which Trajan conquered. It was the greatest extent of the Roman Empire. They only held on to it for a little while before withdrawing. They considered themselves overextended. But in contrast to Britain, the Latin there survived and turned into Romanian. And so that really is such are the vagaries of linguistic history.
May I add something to this?
Yeah, please.
Hi, this is Greg. How are you doing, John?
Fine.
Yeah, well, with regards to Romania, what's happened there, the resistance was so strong that Romans basically destroyed all male population at the time of Trajan. And then they resettled them with retired legionnaires who married local women. And that's why the Roman language dominated there and changed a bit, mixed with the Dacian. That's the reason why Romanian language is Romanized.
Yeah. What's odd is I don't think the Romans did not have a conscious language policy. It just I don't think it was on their minds that they were going to create a new Latin-speaking land wherever they went. There's no evidence, but it just happened because they had these settlement policies and the recruitment of their subject peoples into the military. But it is an odd fact that in Britain there's no Latin, and in Romania there is. It's unknown why. Well, the political side of Latin, by the reign of Augustus, which, as you know, this audience knows, fell along the Millennium Divide, 29 BC to 14 AD, the use of Latin had become a symbol of allegiance to Rome, and Latin's association with the army, the courts, it was the only language permitted in courts, the provincial administration, meant that Latin represented Roman power, particularly in lesser integrated portions of the empire, Greece, Asia Minor, Egypt, Africa, Britain, where the other languages continued to hang on, if only at ordinary people's homes. But we don't know much about that. The expansion of Latin is unique in European history since it happened in discrete stages, always following successful campaigns by the Roman army. It's very different from the expansion of Gaulish, which filled Gaul and northern Italy in the centuries up to 300 BC, or the Slavic languages, which began spreading into the Balkans after 450 AD. Here, in those cases, the engine of language spread was incursions by large-scale raiding parties, followed by settlement. By contrast, when Latin spread, it was the result of a war conducted at the behest of the Roman Senate. Needless to say, yes.
John, could you contrast that to the spread of Greek in the Hellenistic kingdoms?
Yeah, it's Greek was spread. Alexander launched, his invasion of Asia and conquered a whole bunch of places, and he founded cities, and Greek went with them. It was a much less well organized matter. Greek was the dominant language in what's today the Middle East for many centuries, but essentially faded. And the main reason given is that Greek tended to be an urban phenomenon. It didn't penetrate much into the countryside. And as soon as Arabic came along in the form of the Muslim conquest, then Greek just basically dried up and disappeared. And it's an interesting case of a language that has shrunk back to its original homeland. It first spread very widely and then was retracted, replaced by others. It's still spoken in Greece, of course. But
it's similar to Latin in the sense that it was spread as a concomitant of military conquest, and then it became a desirable thing for the locals who wanted to get a piece of the action when all the business was being conducted in the conqueror's language. Yeah,
correct. It is similar to Latin in that sense. The Romans managed to make Latin stick even when their empire disappeared, while Greek did not stick in the areas of conquest. And we don't know a whole lot about the social linguistics of it, but it's usually assumed that there was the more educated part of the population in the cities. The average peasant in the countryside in the East did not know Greek. But that was a long process, taking many centuries. It was, up until the fall of Constantinople, it was a Greek-speaking. There's a slide on that. I'll come back to it though, about the relationship between Latin and Greek. But in the West, Latin became dominant and stayed dominant all the way until today, actually. So one estimate, in the 5 centuries, 100 BC to 400 AD, the number of languages in Western Europe fell from 60 to 12 in those lands that fell under Roman control. So, and certainly the Romans insisted on the use of Latin. There was one anecdote I have. Tiberius, Augustus's adopted son, he ordered a soldier who was questioned in Greek to answer in Latin, and also Claudius, a successor of his, Claudius fired a Greek from a judgeship because he did not know Latin. Conduct of official business had to be in Latin. So the Romans didn't really have an opinion about their language in the early days. Other peoples like the Greeks think their language is the most beautiful, most logical, whatever. It was they thought of it as a rough cut, ordinary mongrel dog of a language. It wasn't thought of as particularly beautiful or logical. It was more part of everyday life than part of higher culture. It was when the Romans encountered Greece that they realized what skill in a language could do. These are aristocratic Romans, of course. They started to care about powers of expression. They began to use Latin as a symbol of Roman power. Latin literature came to be consciously modeled on Greek. Indeed, the Roman adopted the main Greek meter, the dactylic hexameter, for their poetry, and all the Greek literary genres. The only genre the Romans ever invented was satire. And it took more than 3 centuries for a new canon of Latin classics to develop that could stand comparison with the best of Greek. The Greeks had been in Italy as merchants and colonists for a long time. Indeed, the earliest known inscription in Greek letters is from a place just outside Rome that dates from the early 8th century BC. Rome itself was only founded in 753 BC. Now, the Greeks had previously acquired the technique of writing from the Phoenicians, and they were passing it to others through merchants, more likely. But the Romans did not learn writing from the Greeks directly. They learned it from the Etruscans, another influence of that mysterious people. The Etruscans, as I said, were the dominant power in Italy at the time, and the Romans were under their strong influence. Rather odd, the Greeks first adopted a rather fluid direction of writing. They wrote right to left, left to right, even alternated. That's the famous booster feet on. They would sort of write as the ox plows. They would do one line right to left, and then just start at that point and do the next line in the other order. And the Latins, not just the Romans, all the people, the Oscans, the Umbrians, after the Etruscans standardized on right to left, the Latins originally were right to left, and they eventually switched to left to right, which is why we write in that direction today. Now, I won't be going into Latin literature too much. By the time of Augustus, Greek had become a requirement for a Roman aristocrat to participate in cultural and even political life. An immediate effect of Rome's annexation of mainland Greek in the 2nd century BC meant that there was a huge influx of Greek immigrants into Italy, and it filled many jobs at all levels of society, including language teachers and grammarians. So beyond the elementary level, education without Greek was in fact inconceivable in Republican Rome. Classes were conducted from an early age, and and what's odd, in reverse, few Greek tutors showed any inclination to learn Latin. It was even acceptable, apparently, to address the Roman Senate in Greek. So I've been sort of focused mainly on Italy and Western Europe so far, but what happened in the Eastern Roman Empire, in what's today the Middle East and other places? So as Alexander's conquest in the 4th century BC had spread Greek in the East, Greek was always an urban language there. Didn't get out. It's always a question. We know Jesus was an Aramaic speaker, and he had some religious education, so he knew Hebrew. It's always an interesting question how much Greek he knew, and I don't think there's really much. He did. Nazareth is pretty close to a Greek-speaking city, so he was probably exposed to it, but if some of you could help and shed some light on that. But anyway, the symbiosis between Latin and Greek produced a curious situation. In the West, Latin was able to match and just about supersede its master Greek as the preeminent language of culture. The Romans didn't have a particular inferiority complex after the empire grew. Despite their respect for Greek culture, the Romans had become much more confident, and there was also the Roman tendency to regard the Greeks as a feat. They didn't take them entirely seriously. In the East, however, Latin remained unable to displace Greek as a language spoken in daily life. This is in strong contrast with the pervasive dominance of Latin in all other parts of the empire. The Bible translator Jerome, who was a native speaker of Latin from Dalmatia, to today's Albania, who lived in the 3rd century, I believe, 4th century, spent the latter half of his life in Palestine working on his famous Vulgate translation. In a letter to Augustine, the famous Bishop of Hippo, he said, "We suffer a great poverty of the Latin language in this province." So in all the 16th centuries that the Roman Empire was to last in the East, up to 1453, the fall of Constantinople, Latin never spread as a popular language. Even when Constantine shifted the capital from Rome to Constantinople, that would be in 325, I think. It began as the empire was officially Latin, but the use of Latin gradually faded and gave way to Greek in what moderns call the Byzantine Empire. And of course, the contemporaries always called it Rome, and their neighbors, like the Arabs, always called it Rum. So to say the Roman Empire fell in the West in 476 and never recovered ignores the fact that half the empire survived for another 1,000 years. But Latin did hold on for some time in the East, in official areas like the courts, the army. But when the Arabs came in the 7th and 8th centuries, that weakened Roman control substantially. We removed a large amount of territory, and Latin came to seem superfluous to them. Only Greek was left, and their connections with the West were weakening, and Arabic basically supplanted Greek and the other Aramaic languages and other languages in those areas. And it's interesting, as I said, Greek today is only spoken in Greece. There are some Greek speakers in southern Italy, I believe. Maybe some of you know more about that than I do. So it's basically retreated from everywhere it was. So you can see, overall, it's easy to see why Greek speakers were so resistant to Latin in the East. In the West, the Romans had brutally conquered, and the conquered people's elites, being relatively uncultured, had succumbed to Rome's charms. In the East, the Greeks already had an old high civilization, and they felt a great cultural superiority, and they resisted the usage of Latin, and they succeeded. And also, I'm sure it was helped by the Roman elite's love affair with Latin, with Greek, in reinforcing that usage. But in the end, Greek, that's a wax writing tablet, I believe, on the slide. In the end, Greek was never much affected by Latin, but Latin was strongly affected by its cohabitation with Greek. For one thing, the Romans didn't even have a concept of a language grammar before they encountered the Greeks. They acquired that from them. The first grammatical concepts in the West were developed by the Greeks after the Sanskrit, the Indians, the Hindus had developed the first sophisticated grammatical theories in the world, but the Greeks preceded the Romans. So more generally, the Greeks taught the Romans that a gentleman's education should be general, based on literary classics and the skills of public speaking. If you didn't speak well in Rome, you'll never make consul. The latter, of course, was tied up, the public oration business was tied up with Rome's political and imperial cultures. The attitude survived all the way to the British Empire, where classics education, right up till the very end, the classics education in the best writers was considered the best preparation for life in colonial administration. From one viewpoint, you could learn a lot from the Romans. It's made sense. But more mundanely, Latin borrowed many more loanwords from Greek than vice versa. It starts with the philosophical and intellectual vocabulary, which Cicero worked on when his political career wasn't looking too good. He introduced a great many words that have come down to us in the various European languages. So what's lesser known is that Greek was the source of many everyday words in colloquial Latin. Gastronomy was the strength of the Greeks. To them, olive is a Greek word. Elewa. Most musical instruments had Greek names: tympanum, lyre, plectrum, as well. Music itself is a Greek word. And they contribute, I won't go into a catalog, they contributed words in many other areas, including the favorite word for a punch or a blow, French coup, which we borrowed from French, Italian colpa, Spanish golpe. Colpus is actually, it's from Greek, and it originally meant a peck. It's the blow from a bird's beak. The word has become very common in the world's languages now. So the Greeks and the Romans were very picky about what they accepted as models for good language. They both show a strong preference for particular eras, which they thought had the best writing. For the Greeks, the model was the Attic dialect in the 5th and 4th century BC. Attic was the dialect of the city of Athens, and the linguistic mark of quality was in the best writers: Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, Aristophanes, etc. What's interesting, I always find this fascinating personally. What's interesting about this devotion to Attic Greek is the attitude survived right up to the last quarter of the 20th century. Writers strove to imitate the great Athenian writers of antiquity. Linguistically, this involved maintaining features of the old language that were disappearing in spoken Greek as it evolved, such as the distinction between genitive and dative and nouns, use of an optative mood in the verb, although that was disappearing by the time of the Koine, at the time of the New Testament writings. as this, it's called Atticism, the imitation of Attic Greek. This Atticism, a consciously archaizing tendency in languages, had a side effect of likely slowing down the evolution of all of Greek. If you've only studied ancient Greek, modern Greek doesn't look all that different. I haven't looked, I've only looked at modern Greek. I really haven't studied it much, but it really looks very similar to me. And what happened in the West was very different. When after the fall of Rome in 476, in the West, the total breakdown of maybe total is too strong a word, but the breakdown of Latin education in the former provinces such as Gaul led to relatively rapid changes in the spoken language. And at one point, we know much more about the dialect situation. Rome, Latin had different dialects in these areas, and we know more about them than we did, say, a couple of generations ago. But eventually, those dialect variations in the various areas developed into, they became so divergent, they developed into new languages, which we call Spanish, French, Italian, Romanian, etc. But compared in Greek, nothing much has changed, just a few things. You know, if you know French or Italian or one of those languages, really no help at all in comprehending Latin, aside from some of the vocabulary. So the breakdown of Latin education, as I said, in the former provinces, had the effect of cutting Latin speakers off from their literary heritage. It used to be thought, while Latin was changing rapidly into the Romance languages, there were monasteries where diligent monks were preserving the Latin heritage all the way through the Dark Ages. This was true in the sense of copying manuscripts, but it isn't true in a linguistic sense. Knowledge of classical Latin, i.e. the rules of the language that Cicero and Caesar used, was fading in the West as well. There's a famous case of Gregory of Tours, who was a 6th century bishop in France. He's famous for writing a really loopy Latin and confuses cases all the time. And this was one of the most educated people in the society. He's fun to read, though. So it seems, I don't know how to quantify it, but the number of people who could write good classical Latin seems to have gotten quite small in the 5th and 6th century. Now, it's thought now, though, that even though they could write in Latin that was more or less classical, they would have spoken in something that was very different. Even educated people would have spoken what was evolving towards the Romance style of language. It used to be thought that educated people maintained Latin all the way through up to the Middle Ages, well into the Middle Ages, but it seems that classical Latin as a spoken language went out of existence, even though they could still write it. I'm not, it's a British classicist who proposed this theory, Roger Wright, and I'm not completely convinced, because if somebody gets really good at writing in a language, they're going to be tempted to try to speak it. But it's his claim, Wright's claim, that basically classical Latin died, and then under the Carolingian reforms under Charlemagne, where they were setting up the Holy Roman Empire and trying to, he had a monk, Alcuin of York, actually re-standardized the pronunciation of Latin, which had changed, and resurrect the classical Latin. And basically what we call medieval Latin was a creation of Alcuin of York. I'm not, that's the reigning theory. I'm not completely convinced, because if they could write good Latin, they could have spoken it as well. He focuses on the pronunciation. He thinks that their version of Latin, the pronunciation of words had evolved and the spelling had not changed. So like English today, there was a real distinction between the spoken word and the written word. What Alcuin of York did was to reestablish the spoken norm of Latin by insisting that in recitation of the liturgy, every letter had to be pronounced, which was no longer the case in spoken Latin. But I'm not, it's his theory, it's certainly attractive. But basically he says Latin died, and then Charlemagne, through his agent, Alcuin of York brought it back. Anyway, this whole business of archaizing in language, I always find fascinating. A funny aspect is later on in the Renaissance, under the impact of the rediscovery of all the manuscripts containing works from antiquity and written in the West, these scholars started to imitate the Latin writers in antiquity. The trend got so extreme that Erasmus, the Renaissance scholar, wrote a satire portraying a humanist, a Renaissance humanist, that was so obsessed with Cicero that not only would he not use Latin words not found in Cicero, he would only use them in the cases and numbers that Cicero used. Basically, it's like saying that Cicero said ghost, you could use that in your writing, but if he didn't write ghosts, the plural, you couldn't use it, which is just that. It seems to have been true, though. So how Christianity adopted and transformed Latin? It's a curious thing that the Christian New Testament was composed in Greek, sometimes very unstylish Greek, but Christians in the West went on to adapt Latin for their version of the sacred scriptures. Now, that's counterintuitive because usually the language of an original revelation of a religion, the famous example being the Quran in Arabic, it gives the language it is composed in an incomparably high status, but not in the case of the Catholic Church. It abandoned Greek without any apparent regrets. This makes sense from the perspective. The Latin by the 4th century was now dominant in what are now Spain and France, in addition to Italy. That means it was the vernacular of the population. And add this to the fact that from earliest times, Christianity put a great deal of emphasis on effective communication with those people usually illiterate and certainly lacking a background in the classic. This meant that the Greek of the Gospels was relatively simple and unadorned. The New Testament actually varies quite a bit. Luke, the Gospel writer, is considered to have had the best Greek, i.e. he apparently had a Greek that was produced by schooling. The book of Revelation, by contrast, is considered semi-barbaric stylistically. Whoever wrote it did not have a good command of written Greek. But this was a plus in the church's mind. They very much put the emphasis on plain speaking in pursuit of its missionary activities. And I must say, nobody has ever, there may be some people, but I've never enjoyed reading Cicero because of all that periodic structure, and you have to attach the adjectives to the noun, which may be five words away. That's all a stylistic trick that I've never found personally very attractive. It also takes you a long time to figure it out, which is part of the reason why classicists can't sight read Latin. So it's just hard to read for the stylistic reason. So I won't be discussing why and how Christianity went in 3 centuries, the basic question of why Christianity went from being a small cult that really got on the nerves of Roman authorities to becoming the official religion of the Roman Empire, and which eventually led to the outlawing of paganism. I will focus instead on its impact on Latin. One other aspect that is relevant to the story of Latin, that it also swept away Rome's traditional tolerance for other people's religious devotions. As I said, Christianity did not tolerate other religions. Latin was transformed by this. It became nothing more nor less than the single speech of Christian people in Western Europe. From being the language of a multi-ethnic and multi-religion empire, it became the voice of a much more unified culture. Now, it's a curious thing. Greek was basically the religious language of the ancient world. It was the language of most religions in the East. From the Septuagint, that was the version of the Hebrew scriptures that was made translation into Greek for the Jewish community in Egypt. Also, Greek was the language of Manichaeism and Mithraism and other cults. Somehow, Greek just lent itself to religiosity, and most of their liturgies and sacred writings were in Greek. But from the Christian side, we don't have any decrees from church leaders imposing a transition from Greek to Latin in the West in the sacred scriptures, but that's what happened. Early church fathers had written in Greek, later ones did not. Eventually, Latin would be used for everything, for liturgy, theology, and indeed for all kinds of literature. 3 steps were involved. First, Christianity required Latin translations of its sacred texts. This activity began already in the 2nd century. Second, Latin began to be used in the official administration of the church. This is also visible by the mid-3rd century. Finally, Latin was adopted for the liturgy in the 360s or 370s. Strangely enough, the Catholic Mass still contained a little bit of Greek. The Kyrie eleison, Lord have mercy, this continued right. There was one bit of Greek in the Catholic Mass right up until the 20th century, when the Church Council, Vatican II, switched the Mass to the vernaculars, and Latin was abandoned. At the same time as the Pope Damasus commissioned Jerome to produce a revised Latin translation of the Bible as a whole, and this became the famous Biblia Vulgata, as you can see on the slide. Speaking of the Latin Mass, I was an altar boy long ago when the Mass was still in Latin, and we were expected to recite. The altar boys had to, respond to the priest in parts of the liturgy. We had to respond in Latin. Of course, at the age of 8 or so, we knew no Latin, but our priest had us memorize the Latin phrases without comprehending them, which is a very strange way to proceed, but that's how it was done. But anyway, this shift to Latin had a large effect, to Christianity, had a large effect on the Roman non-Christianized elite. The empire was now weakening, they were becoming Christian, and all incentives were to abandon their traditional bilingualism in Greek and Latin, and now they became strictly monolingual in Latin in the West. The old days when a Roman aristocrat would go to Greece and sit at the feet of famous philosophers and learn to speak Greek really well was over in the West. They became strictly monolingual, and Greek became basically forgotten in the West for over 1,000 years. This all made sense to the church. For the less educated, the shift of the liturgy to Latin also was good policy in the eyes of the church. Their vernacular was Latin. Remember, the Romance languages hadn't developed at this time, and the church believed that the liturgy should be comprehensible to the common people. This increased the spiritual value of the services, and also, they thought, promoted doctrinal uniformity. No, it really didn't, but that's what they thought. This is my last slide. That's a picture. The slide contains a sheet from the Gothic translation of the New Testament. We only have it's only partially preserved. Letters of Paul and some of the Gospels. Most of the New Testament is not preserved. I included it just because it's a very good-looking page. But it's not true that the church imposed Latin anywhere. It insisted on using the people's vernacular wherever it was. For example, in the West, in what became Europe, Latin was the choice because that was the spoken language of everybody pretty much. In Egypt, however, the Christians there they saw the Egyptian language, the language of the hieroglyphs, descendant of them, as the best suited to advance the conversion of the people who were not Greek. They were conquered by the Greeks, and they had a Macedonian dynasty, Cleopatra being the final member of it. And they were Greek speakers, but they knew other things as well. They saw Egyptian as the best way to advance the conversion of the people, even though Greek was both the language of the Christian text for them, and Greek was also an almost universal use among Egypt's elite at the time, but not among the common people. But they did the Bible in what today we call Coptic, which is just its etymology is just Aegyptos, the Greek word for Egyptian. It degrades over time phonetically, it becomes Copt. But that's where Coptic comes from. As another thing they did, this Coptic was not written in the Demotic script, which is related to hieroglyphics. They created an alphabet for Egyptian based on the Greek alphabet. They just adopted the Greek alphabet and added 5 letters to cover the sounds that Greek doesn't have, and they still have it today. And I've mentioned the translation of the Bible into Gothic, the language of the Goths, and for some reason the Goths were Arians. This became a Christian heresy. There were people who believed that Jesus had no divine substance in him. He was only man, sort of like proto-Islam. You can think of it. Why the Goths went for Arianism has never been clear to me. I guess they had, particularly effective missionaries working on.
John?
Yes.
My understanding is that the prevailing faction in the Roman Empire would switch from Arian back to non-Arian, and the missionaries were sent out during a period of Arian dominance within the empire. Then, when that switched, it was already established among the Germanic speakers.
Yes, thank you. Well, there is another aspect of the effect of Christianity. This created a problem for educated Christians because if they had a literary education, they tended to see a conflict between their Christian piety and their devotion to a pagan literature. So that's I find one of the most interesting aspects of the Christian transition. The Latin classical culture, you read Virgil and Cicero, it was firmly ensconced among good Christians. And this continued right up until the present time. It's still quite odd when you think it was, they're openly pagan. And that, even though Christianity in many ways demanded doctrinal uniformity, and they'd burn you at the stake in different eras for not being, they had no problem with the pagan Romans or Greeks. They didn't know much about the Greeks at the time, but certainly not the pagan Romans. It's sort of a strange cultural appropriation phenomenon that, as far as the church was concerned, the Roman culture was just fine. And it's very odd when you think about it. Another thing I noticed, the church permitted the pagan days of the week to continue. Tuesday, Wednesday, those are all named from pagan Germanic gods, and church just let it go by, even though they were in other respects they were quite insistent on suppressing anything that wasn't Christian. So the Latin of high culture continued among the elites. They may have been conscious ridden, but it was still very much a part of their world. It deteriorated in what later became to be known as the Dark Ages, but certainly the quality of Latin, there's a famous accusative plus infinitive construction in classical Latin for expressing a subordinate clause. That goes away, and they start using the word for that, quod, quia, or quoniam, to express those things, and things started to evolve, as languages do, started to evolve more to the Romance standard. Prepositions started to be used where, in places where classical Latin just had a special ending, the ablative on the noun. Latin works, if you don't know anything about it, it mocks syntactic arguments in the sentence by attaching little suffixes to nouns, so you can distinguish the subject of the sentence from the object. We do it by, English does it by position now. The subject precedes the verb, the object follows. In Rome, they had much more freedom in the word order because they had unambiguous indications on the word itself, what the role in the sentence was. And they used prepositions much more where Latin would have used cases. And Christians also, they created new literary forms. They preserved the old ones, but nothing was abandoned, though the erotic aspects of Roman literature were disappeared for a while. The primary historical text became gospels and hagiographies, lives of saints and martyrs. So formal speeches, which were so beloved of Cicero, they were replaced in popularity by homilies or sermons. So I'll end at this point. Latin continued on as the major cultured language throughout the Middle Ages and beyond. Greek was mostly forgotten in the West until the Renaissance. So thank you for listening. Any questions?
Thank you, John. That was great.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, John. This was great. And any questions anybody wants to ask?
I got a question. You said earlier about possibility that Etruscan had roots in Phrygian. What's the evidence for that? Is that something that you feel is a strong possibility, or is it just a carryover of people wanting to find a link between the Italians and the Trojans.
Yeah, I think you know more about that than I do. The Etruscans people have linked the name Etruria to Troia. So there may be something there. It's just one of, but I don't have a strong opinion on it myself. But
do you know what's the basis for making that hypothesis?
No, I don't actually. I can't say something. The language of Troy, it was an Anatolian language. We know that. We just don't know which one, whether it was.
And Troy is the Phrygians. The Trojans were Phrygians.
Yeah.
So so it could be that. But even now, I know historians had the hypothesis of the Phrygian origin of Etruscans prevails still. I mean, it could be because of that connection, but it also, I'm thinking, because this language is non-Indo-European. I mean, we know how the agriculture spread by Anatolian farmers.
Because I have to.
I just wonder whether
clean up.
Somebody's talking. You have to mute yourself. And I just wonder if that language survived that migration, and because there was another, there is a common theory about the Kurgan theory about the Indo-European migration that probably happened later, maybe about the second, third millennium BCE, and that's how languages spread, Indo-European languages spread into Europe. But prior to that, between maybe 4th and 6th millennium BCE, that was when the Anatolian farmers moved from Anatolia into Europe and brought the agriculture with them. So I wonder if the Etruscans are kind of people who stayed there and didn't adopt Indo-European languages during the Indo-European expansion, or they came there later. Who knows?
Yeah, it is. It's like Basque. It's an odd language. It's agglutinative is how linguists describe it. They pack a lot of information into the individual word. Their words sort of correspond to our sentences. But if it is true the language of Troy was Indo-European, that would preclude the Etruscans from having a link to them, I think. But we don't know.
But I don't think they were Indo-European, the language of Troy, right?
Well, for a lot of people think so, that it was an Anatolian language, and Anatolian is the current term for the languages that Hittite is an Anatolian language. That's Indo-European. And there are other languages whose names escape me that were spoken in the Phrygian region, and they're related to. Luvian was one.
Yeah, Luvian.
That are definitely related to Hittite, and they are Indo-European. I'm not aware of much evidence for any non-Indo-European languages in that area.
I think the archaeological remains from Troy that have languages on them are Luvian.
Yeah.
How do you spell that? Luvian?
Luwian, right, John?
Yes.
Luwain?
IAN.
Luwian.
And Troy is referenced in Hittite documents, of the late second millennium.
I get very confused by that because the Greeks called Troy Ilion, and I think Ilion is what's referenced in the Hittite. A form of Ilion is referenced in the Hittite documents. But that's all. I don't have strong opinions on links between Troy and Etruscans.
But still, those farmers those farmers, Anatolian farmers, migrated before Hittite culture evolved.
Yeah.
So, I mean, who knows what languages they had there. The Basque language, my understanding that the Basques but they lived in the mountains and may have avoided any conquest. But it's this language is even older. This language of because it's from the hunter-gatherers. I think.
I wouldn't be. It's generally more accepted now among linguists that isolated languages in remote places where transmission is through generations from parents to children, they can retain and they can maintain a steady state for a long, long time. It's really quite remarkable. When you get movements of people and people mixing, particularly in cities, you get rapid linguistic change. And you also get in small communities, remote communities, the languages can get much more complex than languages with more speakers, which is why, in Chinese, Mandarin has the lowest number of tones of any of the related languages. And that's probably because it had more people learning it as a second language. People tend to simplify when they learn something. Their mistake, in effect, they pass the mistakes they make onto their own children, which turns their mistakes into the standard language. But it's true. People living in remote places, it can be, and that's an understanding that wasn't there a generation ago as much.
Yeah, I think.
But
I read that the largest concentration of different languages is in the Caucasus land bridge.
That is true.
And that's all where the places where every time a new conqueror would conquer Mesopotamia, they would flee and they would basically be able to retain their culture in the marginal lands where no one was interested in conquering them.
Yeah, that is true about
the mountains. Yeah,
the Caucasus contains a great concentration of languages. Some of the most difficult languages in the world with the hardest sounds to pronounce. And that's a factor in language. If you learn a language as a child, it may take you a bit longer to learn certain aspects of the phonetics and the morphology. But if you learn a language as an adult, you just won't ever learn those things. So it has a simplifying effect on the language. So if you have people trapped away in the mountains, all talking to each other in small groups and only parent to child language transmission, then you can get some very Baroque linguistic structures. I would say Latin is the easiest of classical Indo-European languages to learn as a second language.
So John, one other thing you mentioned of the intermediacy of the Etruscans in the transition of the Greek alphabet to the Latins. Yeah. I think that's become more controversial in modern scholarship. In particular, T.J. Cornell is really very adamant about saying that the Romans were equal to the Etruscans in having direct contact with the Greeks, and that the model that the Romans learned everything from the Etruscans is not true.
Yeah, and all these discussions, I really, in antiquity, everything is cloudy. I wish people could develop a more probabilistic approach to any of these things.
Well, a lot of it has
my
to do
theory
with,
has a 90% chance of being right.
A lot of it has to do with in terms of Cornell, of archaeology in the end of the 20th century. So it uncovered more things that demonstrated direct links between the Romans and the Greeks without the mediation of the Etruscans.
But there are some features about the Roman alphabet that are, it's usually argued among linguists. Why do we say ABC and the Greeks said alpha, beta, gamma? They had a G sound where we have a C sound, and that's usually attributed to Etruscans' attempts to speak Greek, because Etruscan had no gamma sound. And so they substituted a character that was originally K. So, and that seems pretty solid. It would seem to speak for the Etruscans being the intermediary in the alphabet transmission. But I haven't seen.
I think
I have to admit, I haven't seen.
the argument that Cornell makes is that there was influence going in both directions.
Yeah, it probably is more mess. Yeah, everything is messier than, the idea that the Greeks were in Italy for a long time, so I'm sure the Romans had some doings with them. I'm not aware of
the way he talks about it is he divides Greek influence into having like three major centers where it was transmitted. The very first being the earliest Greek settlement in the mid-8th century at what is now the island of Ischia in the Bay of Naples. And that was when basically the Italians learned first about the technology of the polis. And that was a really profound influence. There would have been no Rome without the concept of the city-state. Then the second major wave came during the 4th century BC, when the Romans conquered Campania, and which was a major center of, that was Naples. Neapolis was the last city that continued to speak Greek in that neck of the woods, and that caused this a second major infusion of Greek culture into Rome. And the third was when the Romans actually conquered Greece during the 2nd century BC and took huge numbers of slaves back to Rome, and statues and everything else that wasn't tied down.
John, what about the dialect developed, that's what I read, called Gallo-Roman, that eventually became lingua franca?
That's a term that's the term I've seen for describing the type of Latin used in Gaul.
Yeah, it must have been influenced by Gaul language.
Yeah, French has always been the outlier in Romance phonologies. It changed dramatically. It's probably the language that diverged the most from Latin, as opposed to Spanish of Italian or Romanian. I mean, if you just look at basically in French, everything after the main stress in a word disappeared. So French words will look a lot different from Latin words, where Italian words, Italian basically retain the same stress system as Latin. You can still hear it today, and their words look a lot more like Latin. So there undoubtedly was linguists call that substrate influence. The Gauls spoke Latin in their own characteristic way, and that ended up as French. But we don't have any.
The anecdote that I heard, John, was that when the British priests first came to the court of Charlemagne, with English priests, the French thought they were speaking Latin. And when these English priests and Irish priests came in, they said, "That's not Latin. That's something else. That's French."
The first accepted document in French is the Strasbourg Oaths of 843. And that's usually considered as the point where definitely French had emerged as a separate language. It was no longer late Latin. But all of that stuff is pretty cloudy, though.
Another comment on the spread of Attic Greek. I think there's a big tendency to credit things to the Romans that really should be credited to the Hellenistic kingdoms. So, we just look at the history of Aristotle, and you see the attractiveness of Athens during the classical period for becoming the center for all of Greece for culture, and then during the Hellenistic period when the Hellenistic kings set up hundreds of cities they all use the Constitution of Athens as
yes.
the model for the constitutions that they created, even though the democratic constitution was a total fraud under the Hellenistic kings, but they always had that on paper. And so there was always like a, desire to see themselves, an aspirational aspect to Attic precedence for the actions of the Macedonians.
Well, the other thing I wanted to add, what do you, John? What do you think about this theory about the Britain? Why the Anglo-Saxon language dominated? So the theory basically say that the reason is that it was not an invasion; there was a migration, and they basically blended with Britain people. I mean, all the Romans left, of course, most of them. They blended with Britons, but also a lot of Britons shifted. They migrated somewhere else, like in Brittany, in France, and further, and that's the reason why, because there was a massive movement of people rather than conquest is usually a fairly small.
Yeah, well, the Germanic invaders got a very bad reputation over the centuries with the native Britons, so there was some violence involved. But there also was a lot of intermarriage, I'm sure.
I think archaeologists have it's always arguments from absence or weak, but I think they were expecting to find a lot of evidence of a violent Anglo-Saxon invasion, which they're failing to find.
Yeah. There is too much talk in a lot of traditional history about the invaders coming in and all the local inhabitants flee to the mountains, when in reality a lot of people just stayed and put up with them, and eventually they grew into one community. I'm sure that's true.
Also, when you talked about the survival of classical authors of Cicero and so forth in the medieval period, what I had, and I think this may have been a teaching company course in linguistics, maybe John McWhorter.
Oh, yes.
And though I don't want to, attribute this to him, because I may not be remembering this correctly, but my understanding was that Cicero in particular survived to be a model for how to write Latin, how to construct, what was, so it was almost like it was stripped of its ideological content and made into just a primer for how to write the most pure and advanced and erudite Latin.
No, Cicero was the most admired writer in the medieval and Renaissance period. There's no doubt about it.
And that's why we have, have Cicero's letters, and we have so much of his writing, which, on an intellectual basis is not as remarkable as in proportion to the amount of writing that survived.
Yeah, it was, they copied what they liked to read, I imagine.
Yeah. So is there anybody else want to say something? I know I've seen Mark raise the hand. I don't know if it's too late.
No, I also posted the question. It was when you had the family of languages, and you had mentioned that italic was a theoretical construct.
Yes.
My question was, is it Proto-Indo-European also a theoretical construct?
Yeah, let me get my, that's how linguists talk about them. You use the word proto as a prefix when there are no written records of something, and basically there's a technique called the comparative method that you look, languages have similarities, and that's, you know, they have words that look the same. They have higher level structures like morphology. The, you know, classical Indo-European languages will have case endings on the nouns and endings on the verbs, and they look similar between the different languages. And so after, you know, it's a long process with lots of scholarly arguments, you distill what seems to be common to all of them, and then you use that to create the what's called the proto-language, the ancestor, the putative ancestor of all of them. And it raises a host of questions because languages come with dialects. When you construct a proto-language, reconstruct a proto-language, you're only getting a partial language. You'll never get the full effect of what the original Indo-Europeans spoke, because we only know what was inherited in the descendant languages. There may have been things in Proto-Indo-European that weren't inherited. They were lost. We just don't know. So there's always a hesitancy talking about you know, we have some idea of what Indo-European like, but we certainly don't have the total picture.
So, John,
For example, there was a big argument. It was thought there's a lack of. Oh, you had a question? Paul?
no, go ahead.
There were very few reconstructible words with the consonant B in them in Proto-Indo-European. There just aren't any. So, and B is in beta, you know, second letter of the alphabet. There are very few, and so it's thought that that's an argument that since B consonants are so common in the world's languages, they're voiced phonetically. Your vocal cords vibrate when you say it. That's linguists call that voiced, you know, B, D, G, as opposed to P, T, K. It's thought that that's a bit of evidence that maybe B wasn't voiced. Maybe and it's thought to be voiced because the etymologies we do have, they're voiced. But maybe in the proto-language it was something else completely different, and it's called the glottalic theory. In other words, Proto-Indo-European may have had a set of consonants that were completely different from any of the daughter languages. But, you know, it's a theory, has a chance of being true, but, you know, you can't prove it. It's just sort of, so it's kind of an art form. But the basic fact, you use proto when it's you have no written evidence of any evidence of the language, but it's built from the similarities in all the daughter languages.
There's something you might enjoy, John. I think it's on Netflix. There's a a series called Barbarians.
Oh, I've heard of it, yeah.
Which is based on the story of Arminius, Herman the German.
Herman the German. Destroyed 3 Roman legions.
And right. And in this series, they speak exclusively their native languages. So all of the Romans are speaking Latin. And there are extensive scenes with Romans carrying on conversations with each other and so forth in Latin. I found it really fascinating.
Yeah, I heard they had Italian. I haven't seen it, but I read about it. They have Italian actors, so the Latin sounds really Italian.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of a beauty because Italian is the closest to Latin, and particularly phonetically.
And I imagine they have the best feeling for making it into natural sentences. So that's really kind of interesting. You get a sense of different flavor of who the Romans were.
Well, it's nice to see Hollywood has gotten the feeling, the historical movies have gotten really good at the look and feel of the ancient world. They work hard at it.
Sometimes.
One of the problems I have is the personalities are almost always modern personalities. They don't bother to. Remember, a movie I always liked was The Kingdom of Heaven, the movie about. That's a really good movie at the look and feel. But you have, in an intensely religious era, the main character never says anything Christian.
Which is Orlando Bloom's character.
God.
Right. But the Crusaders, right?
Yeah, it's basically a modern character. California
Yeah,
around the year
the
2000.
moderns have a lot of difficulty dealing with ancient ideology. You know, I mean, you always see it in films based on the
Yeah.
Iliad. You know, they have no idea how to treat the gods.
Yeah,
You know, do you treat them as a you know, figures of fun, or do you treat them as just being,
yeah.
you know,
that's
things
right.
that superstitious characters like King Priam believed in? You know,
Yes.
where more practical people like Hector didn't.
Yeah,
There's been
one of my
there's-
favorite things about the ancient world was that miniseries Rome.
yes,
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
And
terrific.
actually, they really worked hard on getting the personalities right. It really, all the characters had really alien flavor to them. Especially one character was incredibly superstitious, and as the Romans were. But that's a rare exception, actually. Usually, the characters themselves are completely modern, even if the
Rome
look
had a
and feel
really,
is pretty authentic.
Rome
Yeah,
had a really
Cicero was
compelling.
not presented very well in that series.
What was not?
Cicero was not presented
No,
very well. I kind
no.
of thought he wasn't a coward. I thought he was a courageous man, but he was presented as almost like a coward, you know?
Yeah, it was negative about Cicero, and
Well, you
Cicero
got-
was this.
Understand that what you know about Cicero is what Cicero says about
Yeah.
Cicero.
Uh,
So,
yeah, but that was an interpretation, kind of very a little
well, but
unusual.
I'm saying that this, you know, most of what we know about Cicero is what Cicero wrote about himself, and he wanted
Correct.
to see his intervention against Catiline, the Catiline conspiracy,
Yes.
Right.
as a moment in which he saved Rome, but nobody really shared that opinion of what he did, and he was convicted of
Yep,
killing
that's-
Romans without due process of law, and he was always trying to, you know, to reconstruct his image and reinvent himself, as they say. And then when we see the way that he intrigued with the young Octavian and was completely outmaneuvered by an 18-year-old boy, that's historical. That's real.
But you know, Catilina conspired to kill him. He was a consul at the time, right? Cicero. So I can see he was really incensed, you know, against him because he was going to kill Cicero.
Once again, yeah, I guess, I mean, that's what it's in Sallust, but it's very, very, I mean, I've read Sallust carefully a few times, and there seems, each time I read it, I end up with more questions than knowledge of what actually happened.
Right. And Caesar was, you know, went kind of defended Catilina.
Well,
a bit. Yeah.
Caesar opposed Caesar opposed the summary judgment of death. And that was always, you know, that, and in fact, Cicero's enemies later on would always bring that up, you know, as, you know, guilty of killing Roman citizens without a trial. It was always their standard way of you know, of beginning a political invective against Cicero.
Yeah, but as far as like, do you think the way he was presented in the series Rome was accurate?
I think it was. I think, you know, if you want to get a sense of Cicero, I urge you to read his letters. Cicero's letters, because they were not written for public consumption. You know, they're not orations, you know, but they are just, you know, and you see how vain he is and how concerned he is about what people think of him and how trivial he is on so many different things. You really, you don't get to know anybody in the ancient world the way you get to know Cicero.
Oh yeah,
that's because of his letters.
But in the movie, he was cowed by Antonius.
And that seemed to be, you know, not inaccurate either.
Yeah, I'm not so sure. All right. Anyway,
I don't think.
It's a matter of
well, I don't think Cicero had any military experience. So,
you know, I enjoy as a historical novel about ancient Rome is the series by Mary McCullough, which starts with the first man in Rome.
Yes.
It starts with Marius and it goes all the way through Antony and Cleopatra.
And then grass crown is the second one, right?
Yeah, and he
Yeah.
and in her telling, and she's she's very knowledgeable about the the academic knowledge and the academic controversies, and she depicts Cicero as being a guy that kind of hooked up with Pompey, because Pompey had all of the force and the aggressiveness, but he was unlearned, and he was a country bumpkin, and he basically protected Cicero and let him basically complete the compulsory military service that was required for a Roman to have a political career,
Yeah.
as a member of Pompey's staff, where Pompey could use Cicero to make up for his own weaknesses in, essentially Cicero became Pompey's mouthpiece during the period, and I'm talking about the period before the first triumvirate.
I've always found Cicero quite off-putting. The fast-talking, high-priced lawyer is
Right.
how he comes across to me, and always concerned with his public image.
You could certainly see him, making a speech in the U.S. Congress for the benefit of the cameras back in Des Moines, Iowa, or wherever he comes from.
Well, he was a novus homo too.
Yes.
He was not an aristocrat by any means.
Which was another reason that he was so defensive about his actions as consul, and the fact that he was always so insecure about the support that he got from the established nobiles.
Yeah, he was not of senatorial rank.
Right, he was a new man. He was the first man of his family to reach the Senate.
And became a consul still. I mean,
it's
quite an achievement.
Well, and 100 years before, it never could have happened. It was only in the 1st century BC that Romans, without significant military achievement, were able to achieve the consulship.
Sure.
That's that's the only period when being an advocate kind of somewhat was an adequate substitute for celebrating a triumph.
Sounds like the U.S. Military experience used to be a requirement for the presidency.
I remember, one of the reasons that all the Republicans hated Bill Clinton, because he was a draft dodger and because he smoked but he didn't inhale. That kind of transparent
decadence is building.
lie.
I could never stomach Cicero, to be honest. He's such an obvious poseur, and
I've had to read his philosophical works, in for classes that I've taken, and it's so derivative. And he sets up straw men and then he demolishes them. In other words, not really honest philosophical argument. He's a poseur.
Yeah, that's.
So what do you think about spread of Latin in kind of Renaissance time, about the role of Desiderius Erasmus? I know you mentioned him, but from what I remember, I thought he was like real authority, because he wrote this book about the Roman proverbs that everybody was like quoting, and that was considered to be cultured. What do you think?
Well, he was considered the finest Latinist of his generation. That was widely accepted. I mean, his performance in Latin was evidently better than anybody else's in eloquence. And as I indicated, we don't know much about, this was a learned language for all of those people by the time of the Renaissance. Nobody was learning it as a first language, so I can imagine there would be a wide spectrum of skill levels. Because some people, talent matters. Some people can learn a second language really well, and the critical part is accent, of course. If you get the perfect accent in the second language, a completely natural one, 99% of people will say you have a good command of whatever the language is. And if you have a bad accent, then no matter how many words you know, no matter how complex your syntax, you have a poor speaker. But when everybody is a second, speaking it as a second language, and they did speak it extensively, there must have been a wide spectrum of skill levels, and Erasmus was always considered the best, so he must have been remarkably good. And that was the highest skill to have in intellectual circle. There's a great scene in Man for All Seasons, which Henry VIII rose up to Thomas More's estate, goes up the Thames or somewhere, and he gets off of the royal barge and he walks on shore, and More and his scholarly daughter, I forget her name, meets him, and then Henry starts the conversation in halting Latin, and she just blows him away with her response. He doesn't even understand it, which is probably the situation in Renaissance Italy.
Yeah. Great movie. Great movie.
Wonderful. Totally false to history. I mean, whether Peter, I always thought, being brought up as a Catholic, I thought Thomas More was a saint. He is a saint. But then I find out, I read Peter Ackroyd's biography, he was as eager to burn his religious opponents as anybody else. And he burned quite a few.
Yeah, but he resisted the Reformation.
Yes.
So, I mean, in that sense, it was, that's...
Erasmus was a failure historically. He was the person best positioned to prevent the split in the church, because he was a moderate, and he failed, and that's how we got Protestantism. But
in that way, but from one of his contributions, from what I understand, he wrote this he compiled all the Roman sayings. I think it was called Adagia or something. And it became so popular. It was one of the most popular books of the time, and everybody was quoting in Latin, because it was all in Latin, all the sayings, all the proverbs. He did all this collection, and it became kind of he was in a way spreading the knowledge of Latin, because if you'd quote him at the right time, in the right place, I mean, you'd earn adoration. So it kind of spread.
He was
Latin.
the most famous public intellectual of the time. I mean, it's a remarkable career. But in scholarly circles, Latin survived until the 19th century. I have a grammar of the Ethiopian language that was written in 1865 in Latin. And then the writer wrote an introduction, and it was kind of hilarious. It says, writing a grammar in Latin is a big pain.
I mean, weren't things like Newton's writings? Newton wrote in Latin.
Yes.
In the 17th century.
It's hard to recapture that world, that bilingual world. If I would say you can't study English literature before the 19th century without having a good command of Latin, just because it permeates. We're not even aware of how much Latin is in our speech.
And Greek too, among the better educated Anglo-Saxons.
I mean, you read, older literature, you see ablative absolutes all over the place in English. The legates having been sent, legati missi, and that you see that particular stylistic habit just carried over into English. It sounds archaic now, but that's what makes it sound archaic. So,
but what do you think? What do you think about, like, when we talk about Greek language? From what I understand, did not develop to the point of unrecognition. Like the people who speak contemporary Greek, they probably understand some ancient Greek. While and I understand that it goes back, but still, while in Rome, the heart of Latin language, and maybe surrounding the Latium, it didn't happen. It was changed so much that the contemporary Romans would never understand Latin if they haven't learned it, right?
Right.
Why do you think that happened? How did they preserve it in Greece?
The Greeks maintained their language teaching capability better than the Romans
Yeah.
did. They were able to
And
teach
They were also
classical.
conquered.
It's probably related to the longevity of Constantinople.
Oh yeah, I mean that's where Atticism
Maybe, yeah.
really got. They really tried to writers in the Byzantine Empire.
So,
Empress,
the
one who wrote
the
the
Greek
Electra.
speakers never lost power until
No.
Yeah.
the Ottoman conquest, and then there was a huge exodus of Greek scholars to the West, which is how the West first became introduced or reintroduced to the Greek classics.
Yeah. It makes sense, and I'm sure a lot of them went to Greece proper. Yeah, after that's probably why the Greek language survived.